Hello and welcome to another installment of For the Living of These Days, the Prophetic Mystic Edition. A hymn that's been going through my head the past few days, God of Grace and God of Glory, and two of the stanzas. Cure your children's warring madness. Bend our pride to your control. Shame our wanton, selfish gladness. Rich in things and poor in soul. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, lest we miss your kingdom's goal. Save us from weak resignation to the evils we deplore. Let the gift of your salvation be the glory evermore. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage. Serving you whom we adore. In light of all that is unfolding in our world today, our community, our nation, it's like Jeremiah before his accusers in verse 20 as we cry like the prophet. So we begin with the prophet, and then I want to move and end with the mystic and bring those two together in this conversation. I guess it's one way, but hopefully this will at least imbue in you some deeper questions of response. And Jeremiah, as he denounces his persecutors, O Lord, you have enticed me, and I was enticed. You have overpowered me, and you have prevailed. I have become a laughingstock all day long. Everyone mocks me. For whenever I speak, I must cry out. I must shout. Violence! Destruction! For the word of the Lord has become for me a reproach and derision all day long. If I say I will not mention him, or speak any more in his name, then within me there is something like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I am weary with holding it in, and I cannot. And I cry justice to seek a voice of hope in a world of pain. So finding our voice and our response in this time, and that image of fire shut up in our bones. Enemies everywhere. Us and them, the rule of law. I can in the midst of this time stand mute in the face of systemic evil, complicitous in my silence, but how shall I respond beyond the religious and the political rancor? Respond. How do we find our voice in times like these? I found myself then sitting with Jeremiah, the prophets, but then I found myself at the end of my lamentation with the mystics, with Thomas Merton, with Teilhard de Chardin, or Teresa of Avila. We all have enemies. We say the right is the enemy of the left is the enemy of the right. Black and white, police and civilian, police and black community, Republican, Democrat, gay, straight. And so maybe in the midst of this, we come to Jesus and we figure the voice that we seek to find is a voice of radical love, compassion, and mercy in an otherwise violent and destructive time. How do we find that? That's where the mystic meets the prophet. In the midst of such pain and violence, I want to stand on the side of love. But in the midst of this stance, I can get attacked from both sides. Does God take a side? Does love take a side? How? These are my thoughts this week. Doesn't God take the side of humanity? Does God's children bent on self-destruction and devouring each other in hatred and violence? Like a fire shut up in my bones, I wanted to go deeper. I wanted a deeper conversation than just reacting, knee-jerk reacting. And I found myself with Paul, as Paul writes in Ephesians 6. For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, you take up the whole armor of God so that you may be able to withstand that evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm. And what is that armor? What is that armor made of? Paul goes on. It's fastening the belt of truth. So truth is a component of this. A breastplate of righteousness. Shoes that make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. With all these, then you take a shield of faith. Faith becomes your shield, which you will be able to quench the flaming arrows of the evil one. You take the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. In light of our social unrest and political insanity surrounding and swirling around our world, when we feel powerless and fearful, clothe yourselves with Christ. Comes the gospel. As the world slowly unravels into the darkness, how do we bring light? How do we enter the fray? We find that there is a power greater than humanity, and we are not the enemies that we think we are. Prophets and mystics, a prophetic mystic, turn to the prophets and reveal the truth in our lives and have the courage to speak the truth, and the mystic to show a radical, fiery love of God and neighbor. Bravely speak into the hatred and into the destruction with radical love. We can sit with lamentation, and I did with chapter 1 of Jeremiah's lament. How lonely sits the city that once was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was great among the nations, she that was a princess among the provinces, has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. How do we go when we are, where do we go when we are overwhelmed? And where we start when society seems to be so overwhelming that we can't even speak, sighs too deep for words. Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes in Life Together. It's another book I went to this week. He writes, Jesus Christ lived in the midst of his enemies, and at the end all his disciples deserted him. On the cross he was utterly alone, surrounded by evildoers and mockers. For this cause he had come to bring peace to the enemies of God. So the Christian too belongs not in the seclusion of a cloistered life, but in the thick of foes. There is this commission, his work, her work. The kingdom is to be in the midst of your enemies. And he or she who will not suffer this does not want to be in the kingdom of Christ. Wants to be amongst friends, to sit amongst roses and lilies. Not with the bad people, but the devout people. O you blasphemers and betrayers of Christ, if Christ had done what you are doing, who would have ever have been spared? Bonhoeffer ends with Luther. The prophet brings the truth and the honesty in the midst of the fray, and in the midst of enemies. In the midst, the prophets speak and exhibit in their lives, they exhibit in their body the very violence that they see. They take it upon themselves. They take the sackcloth and the ashes. They name the pain. And then they begin to create the self-fulfilling prophecy of hope, returning to God, returning to relationship, a refining fire, revealing the true enemy. That is the powers and principalities that infect the soul, the human mind and the human heart, of hatred and fear and broken relationships and greed and lust and anger and gluttony and apathy, envy. This is where we pivot, and because finally comes the mystic. Leads us to the divine fire, divine love, deep, all-consuming love of God and the love of others. Even the love of our enemies, Jesus would pour out to us in his word. That fire shut up in our bones is God's love for God's creation. The essence of mysticism is not, as some think, these visions and levitations or some other extraordinary phenomena. On the contrary, it is the growing into union with the God of love. Christian mysticism, writes in the Anthology of Christian Mysticism, Christian mysticism is a way of life that involves the perfect fulfillment of loving God, neighbor, and all God's creation and oneself. It is bound within the great commandment. If we can be so radically infused with this fire of divine love, and it emanates out into the world, it's the only power that will save this world and save our brothers and sisters, our siblings. Bernardo Oliveira, speaking of the great 12th century mystics, uses a dramatic but very beautiful image. He writes, thus, mysticism is the reality of grace accompanying the whole life of the believer, transforming him or her from dawn into midday and from an individual burning coal into an all-consuming fire. So we create pockets of resistance in the midst of a world seething in the heat of hatred. We bring radical love and compassion and mercy, and we enter the fray with that armor, then helping each person recognize the image of God they were created, that each person is filled with the same fire of love. I love the image, two images in conclusion here. One is from Thomas Merton in his Revelation on the corner of 4th and Walnut in Louisville. And another is Teilhard de Chardin. It then comes as, what is the message? What is that voice? What do we bring into relationship with our siblings in this world that are lost in fear or hatred? In his Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, he writes, Merton writes, in Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, and that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, a world of renunciation and a supposed holiness. The sense of liberation from the illusionary difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being a man, a member of a race in which God, God's self, became incarnate, as if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me. Now I realize that what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around, shining like the sun. You couple that revelation to find that image, that fire of God with imbued in every human being that divine love. And Teilhard de Chardin, someday after mastering the winds and the waves and the tides and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And then, for a second time in the history of the world, humanity will have discovered fire. So be a mystic prophet in the world. Find where your greatest passion can enter into the greatest hunger and need of your neighbor, wherever you are. Grocery line, in the neighborhood, on the street, in your family. Small acts of radical love ripple out into the world to consume it with the fire of God's divine love. And that's where I am. That prophetic mystic, then, is a truth-telling, radical, loving, full embracing presence of God's spirit of love in the world, and we are the vessels of that. Love, radical love for God, transcends all human conspiracy theories and empty human rhetoric. Love of neighbor and love of self is the only weapon that can disarm a society in exile, a society infected with the powers and principalities of the darkness that invade the soul of humanity. So, a poem that has been sitting with me for 4 weeks now, Edwin Markham. He drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. Love will save the world. Be a prophetic mystic the best way you can. Peace.